Today's episode of the Counselling Tutor Podcast is sponsored by Web Healer. You're a counsellor in private practice and you need a website, or you've got an existing website which you need help with. Web Healer are offering Counselling Tutor Podcast listeners, that's you, £100 off the cost of a website design and build. Now, Web Healers specialise in websites for counsellors and psychotherapists. It's what they do. And the Web Healer team provide a completely non-technical, done-for-you solution, leaving you to focus your time on your clients. Operating for 20 years, Web Healer are a trusted resource amongst counsellors when it comes to getting your practice online. So get the package details and claim your £100 off coupon for your new website by going to counsellingtutor.com/website. That's counsellingtutor.com/website.
Welcome to the Counselling Tutor Podcast, the must-listen-to podcast for students of counselling and psychotherapy. Here are your hosts, Rory Lees-Oakes and Ken Kelly.
Hi, I'm Rory, and with me, as always, is Ken. How are you doing, Ken?
I'm exceptionally well. Thank you for asking, Rory. You've joined us at the Counselling Tutor Podcast. It is episode 266, 3 stops on today's journey, starting off with that theory and practice, where today we're going to be thinking about moving up to the next level. Are you a student? You're on a course. That course is coming to an end. You're going to continue your studies. What do you need to know? Moving on from there into practice today, we're going to look at an interesting topic. Can you be too congruent? We're called to have congruence within our counselling relationship. Is there a boundary on that congruence where it kind of oversteps into something different? And then in practice matters today, we have a special guest. It's Mamood Ahmad, who is going to be speaking about introducing difference, diversity, and inclusion, using anti-oppressive practice foundations, Rory. So it's a packed episode, and we'll kick it off with that theory and practice, moving up to the next level. I guess it is years at this time of the year that students may be finishing where they are and considering continuing their studies, Rory.
Yeah, absolutely, Ken. At the time of recording this podcast, we're in May 2023, and certainly in the UK, the academic year finishes the end of June, beginning of July. And there'll be lots of people listening to this who maybe got their applications in for the next level, or are excited about moving up to the next level, or may have a lot of questions and reservations about moving up to the next level. And I guess I'm hoping that our conversation today, Ken, will kind of enlighten people and help them think about what the reality is, because the reality is every time you move up, it's a bit like playing football or soccer, as they say in the US. When you move up the leagues, it gets just a little bit tougher. It's a little bit more demanding. And when you move into your practice years, so in England, that would be what we would call level 4 for our level 4 or above. For our friends in Scotland, that would be diploma years, because they have a slightly different qualification level in Scotland. You're working with clients, which is even more demanding, and more is being asked of you. So I think it's really important that people have a really good understanding of what they're signing up for, Ken.
Yeah, definitely. And, I think it starts with having a look at your why. What started you on this journey in the first place? Was it just an interest, or did you have a deep want to make a difference out in the world? Because there is a saying that suggests that if your why is strong enough, then the how becomes easier. And because it does get challenging. And I guess one of the things that we hear again and again and again, Rory, specifically at that practice time of study, where you are studying, you are preparing for assignments and potentially exams that you have to write. So there's that self-study. You have to look at your own personal development during that time. You may be in placement seeing clients. You may be going to a supervisor. You may be holding a family down. You may have a job that you're kind of using to to kind of aid on this journey. There can be a lot going on, and it can get stressful, and it can get panicky at times. And going back to your why am I doing this, is a safe place. Because I certainly know, Rory, when I was on my journey, there were times where I would say, why am I doing this? What am I doing? And I needed to go back to my why to measure, was the journey worth it? Because it can get pretty challenging the higher up you go.
Absolutely, Ken. And I think the why for most people, or perhaps I should be a bit more kind of directive, the why, certainly when you're moving into your practice years, should be to help people.
Yeah.
Because counselling is about helping people. And, that's, I can't speak for Ken, but I'm sure he would agree that is why we signed up to be counsellors. We signed up to help people. In my case, because I saw the wonderful change that counselling had to someone who was very close to me, who was in a very difficult position. And I was so taken by that, I effectively left my job and lived on beans on toast for 2 years and became a counsellor. I still like beans on toast. I still have beans on toast, but not 3 nights a week. And it was difficult. It was a tough call. And when my former students would say, what's level 4 like? I would say it's 2 years where it will take your waking thoughts and your dreams, and you will think of nothing else, and it will just fill up all your time. And they would look at me a little bit quizzically and say, well, maybe I've done a degree and that didn't take that much time. And I'll say, it's a lot tougher than doing a degree. And if you're doing a degree in counselling, it's a lot tougher than doing any other degree.
Yeah.
Because you've got so many different ingredients within that. You've got your own personal development, as Ken spoke about, which may impact on your relationships with other people as you move through the arc of the course. Certainly the courses I taught on the course I was on, lots of people separated from partners, lots of people had to renegotiate the relationships. There's the academic side, making sure you hit the criteria or get the assignments passed. And then there's the practice side, developing your practice, working with clients, liaising with your agency, where your placement is, your supervisor. There's a lot going on, Ken.
There is. And it's about asking yourself this question: is it worth it? So from my point of view, 100% yes, definitely it's worth it. If your why is to go out there, make a difference in the lives of others, to serve, because I guess that's what counselling is. And if it's worth it. The other challenges, like academics, as you spoke about, Rory, about balancing that work, family life, job life, supervisor, placement life, it can all be done. And tens of thousands have done it before you. So yes, you can do it if your why is strong enough. Academic side of things, it's one of the things we hear so often, and we've spoken in so many podcasts about this, is the struggle, maybe coming back to studying later in life, maybe feeling that you weren't academic in school. None of that really matters. There is help available. Tutors are great if you can speak to your tutor. And of course, we have resources like Counselling Tutor website, where we have hundreds of free resources. And then, of course, we have our student library, which is a paid-for resource, Counselling Study Resource it's called. And that is kind of lectures that you'll be covering on your course, and academic writing assistance and help, telling you how to do it, how to hit those criteria. So you can get over those hurdles, all of the hurdles. But is it right for you? I think is the big question that you need to ask yourself. And the way that training is structured, certainly from my understanding, you might start off with an introduction to counselling, and it's certainly how I started. Here's my story. I was driving my car. I was working as a sales director, selling chemicals into the construction industry, Rory, of all things. You were. And I was driving my car, and I heard a talk radio interview of somebody that had gone through some darkness, and they had come out the other end and trained to become a counsellor so that they could help and share that there was hope. And I listened to this, and I reflected on my own journey. And I remember exactly where I was when I heard that, and I thought, I'm going now to the local collegiate. And I walked up to the counter and I said, do you do counselling courses? And they said, yes, we do. And I said, right, where do I sign up then? And that was an introduction. That was 10 weeks of learning what counselling was and seeing whether it was for me. At the end of those 10 weeks, I was convinced this was a new direction for me. So I took the next step, which was a year of study. It was part-time study. I was still doing my job. And for a year, I studied and balanced that, and I fell more and more in love with counselling and the outcomes that could bring. But then it went from to the next level, where I would need to commit 2 years of my time, that the studies became more robust, that I would need to go into practice, that I would need to have a supervisor. And at the time, I was holding down 2 jobs to be able to make all this work and be able to pay for it. And I had to have a bit of a chat with myself and say, is this really what I want? You know, I'm comfortable in my director's position. And I realized that if I was going to go ahead, that I would need to look at changing my career. And it took a lot of chatting with the family, but eventually I walked into our owner of the business and I said, that's me, I'm taking another road. And that was really hard at the time. That was really, really hard at the time. Was it the right thing to do? 100% yes, it was the right thing to do, but it was not easy.
Yes. It's interesting. Our paths do have a bit of a parallel. I was a sales manager, and much the same thing happened with me. And of course, I think it would be absolutely remiss of us to talk about this subject without talking about the elephant in the room, which of course is money. You know, when I trained 20 years ago, even taking inflation into account, courses were a lot cheaper because they were funded by the government. Nowadays, you know, the cost of these courses, I've not really been following course costs, because obviously it's not my area of interest anymore. But I caught in a Facebook page some of the fees, and they can be eye-watering. Now, there's lots of loans out there that you can take, but obviously those have to be paid back, student learning loans. Mm-hmm. So it is an expensive journey. And you know, and I remember even when I did my course, I worked in a shop for 2 years. I sold cameras, which was great. It was a great job for 2 years. But I earned about, I think I earned about a quarter of my salary, hence the beans on toast. And it was tough, but like you say, the why kept me going. I used to think to myself, just a little bit further, just the next week, just the next couple of weeks. And eventually I graduated, and well, you know, the rest is history really, but it can be tough. And I think people need to know and need to hold on to that why. That's the most important thing. If we take away everything else, our job is to help somebody. Yeah. It's to be of service to somebody. And, you know, through my career as a therapist, I've met many people, some of which I have to say probably wouldn't have been here now if they hadn't have seen a counsellor, me or maybe someone else. But that's the work. That's the important bit. That's what we do.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yes. And it's so powerful. There is something called the ripple effect. So the client that you might see as a counsellor, yes, there may be a change or a movement within their life, but that ripples out into the ones that are closest to them, perhaps their family, perhaps their loved ones. It might change how they show up in life, how they show up for their friends, how they show up in their job. It makes a big difference. And very often we don't get to see any of that. You know, you work with the client and then they move on. So the why has to be strong enough to not need accolades, to not need feedbacks and thanks and pats on the back. There was a time in my life, Rory, that I worked as a professional entertainer where my living was made on the loudness of the hand claps. And all that goes away in counselling. And I guess it also, when you're considering your why, what is it that you want to do? Do you want to go into private practice? Do you want to go on to study in a few years and become a clinical supervisor and be there for the counsellors? What is the route? Do you want to work in the NHS? Because the course you choose, you may kind of map against that. And you don't have to finish all of the counselling training to be able to use what you learn. You can go on an introduction course for 10 weeks and learn about counselling, and then use listening skills in your work. Or the skills are transferable, I guess is what I'm trying to say. You don't necessarily have to become a counsellor. And I think that many of our students, Rory, when we were teaching together, chose not to become counselors at the end. They chose to take those skills, the personal development, which is amazing, and transfer that into teaching or working in a hospital or whatever was the best fit for them. So there's no failure if you're kind of looking at this and going, you know what, I don't want to complete this. You're not dropping out. You're taking with you amazing skills. And as you said, Rory, when you were teaching me, it's CV gold. Listening skills are CV gold. Doesn't matter what you're doing. And I'm not encouraging anybody to not carry on their counselling practice. Not what it's about. So what we're trying to say here is there's choice out there. Look at the providers. Have a look at where you want to go and choose the course that's going to best resonate with you. And just be aware that there is a massive commitment, including the commitment of self. Rory mentioned, it might be a bit more difficult than a different degree. Why? Because you yourself are part of this development process. Whereas if you do a degree on another subject, you learn about that subject, you write about that subject. But when you're studying counselling, you're bringing yourself, and very often you're writing about yourself and your development and your journey through this. And that is not always wonderful light bulb moments. Aha, oh, that's amazing. Sometimes that can be painful. It's about looking at what is the support the support structure you have around you. Who can you speak to if you're going through a particularly vulnerable time and maybe an element of self has popped up that is causing pain? Do you have support around you? I think there's so much to consider when thinking about studies.
Indeed, Ken. And I always say that counsellors aren't trained, they're forged. They're forged in the fire of personal development. And, you're right in what you say, Ken. There's lots of people I've taught who've gone on to do other things. But one of the things they will tell you, and I meet them occasionally, I bumped into former students because I still live in the area where I started off my teaching practice, and I bump into students. And they tell me that the foundation of the counselling skills, the listening skills, the introduction to what is psychological theories about what motivates people and how people experience the world have been so useful in the jobs they've gone on to do. And they've retained, if you like, that way of being. And they're all, from what I can see, quite happy, successful people. The ones I talk to, perhaps the people who aren't successful, I won't probably bump into, but they do very well. And for those who go on to study and become qualified counsellors, I sometimes come across former students who've got stellar careers now, absolute stellar careers. And one of the things, just to bring it back to the beginning, Ken, for those people who have those kind of really, really stellar careers, is that their why is still as strong now as it was then.
Bingo.
It's bingo.
That's it.
Yeah.
What's your why? Speak to your peers about it. Have a think about it. Jump into the Facebook group. You'll find that by going to Facebook and putting in the term Counselling Tutor. Knock on the door. We'll let you in. Come and speak about it in there. Let's get these conversations going. And of course, that is Theory in Practice. Theory to Practice is proudly sponsored by CounsellingSkillsAcademy.com. I'm Ken Kelly, and I've got a real burning passion for counselling skills. I've built training that takes the doubt out of using counselling skills. You get to see the counselling skills used in real live sessions by a qualified therapist. Full sessions, real material, real counselling skills. To find out more, go to CounsellingSkillsAcademy.com. As we move away from theory and practice, we move into practice today. We look at something that is contemporary, something that's going on now. And congruence, we're told, Rory, that within counselling, specifically the person-centered model, that congruence is one of those necessary conditions. We need to be congruent. But is there a point where congruence can maybe go too far?
Interesting one. And this is something that came up in our Facebook group. And if you don't know about our Facebook group, and I'm sure lots of people listening do know about our Facebook group, if you go to Facebook, type in Counselling Tutor, you'll find us, and just go in and join the party, and you'll find lots of useful people to talk to, and lots of interesting conversations. And one conversation that came up was someone had posted a chapter of a book, quite an older book. I seem to remember it when I trained, and it was about some therapist who was working with a client and felt bored, started to yawn, and said, I'm feeling bored as well. And there was a rich conversation about this is really rude, this is really offensive, and da 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 da. And it did get me thinking, Ken, has congruence changed throughout the years? And before you go on to answer that, I'll just share a little story. When I was kind of doing lots of jobs before I ended up here at Counselling Tutor, I was a support worker. I worked in a hostel for people who'd come out of prison, resettling them. And some of them had drug addiction. And one particular guy was doing a level 3 course. He was actually doing a level 3 course, which was really good. And he said, we talked about congruence, and he said, I'll tell you about congruence, Rory. He said, I turned up to my therapy, and he'd used heroin. And he said to the therapist, I don't want to go, I don't want to stay because I've got to look after my kids. And the therapist said, I won't let you look after my kids in the state you're in. And I thought, oh my goodness, I don't think I'd have said that as a therapist. And here's the thing. The guy said, that was the biggest wake-up call I ever had.
Wow.
And it's an interesting discussion about how much congruence you can have, especially in a world where, I don't know, people, I mean, I might be speaking out of turn here, but there seems to be a bit of a change in society about what people will get offended about. And I'm sure that is something that feeds into therapists' rooms and their thinking about when they're reflecting back to clients.
Yeah. It's a really interesting topic, this. So I look back to, I think that my introduction to counselling course where congruence was covered, and it was what is congruence. And my understanding of congruence is that you feel and experience internally, you show externally. Now, what's interesting to me in that is it doesn't say what you think you say. And I think that congruence is not necessarily about what we're thinking, but more about how we reflect back the feelings. And I think that for me, there is a fine line between congruence and rudeness. Somebody just wanting to get something, and I'm not necessarily talking within a counselling session now, speaking outside of that, where somebody might just be blunt to the point and appear rude. And is that congruence? Where is that boundary? And then how is that applied in the counselling room? So my understanding of congruence in the counselling room is that it is in service, all that we do in the counselling room is in service of the client. Client sitting in front of you with the example that you used, Rory, that had obviously been using a narcotic and was showing, they will have been showing visibly that they were impaired at the time. The counsellor not being congruent, I guess that would have not been serving this client. Being congruent, it made an impact on the client. But it wasn't what was it not what the counsellor was. Yeah, it's tricky. I'm stuck. I'm stuck on it. Yeah, I think it needs lots of discussion and lots of thinking about.
Well, let me throw this in. I think that those conditions, it's sometimes called the core conditions, and we'll go with that for the purpose of this conversation. But I think that they're not used on their own. They're an amalgam. I've always said they're an amalgam. They're like getting, children's plasticine, where you get different colours and you wrap them up, and eventually you get this kind of, big bowl of plasticine with different colours all the way through it. You can say, well, that's red and that's blue and that's yellow, but I don't know where they start or where they begin. And I think that they're underpinned by unconditional positive regard and empathy. They don't work all on their own. But if I was having a long think about this, because it was quite an animated discussion in the Facebook page, And every single piece of personal growth that has been significant in my life, I'm speaking for me now, other people are obviously different, has been where people have been thoughtful, not kind, where they have been direct and not masked, where they've told me the truth. And I think there's something in that. Maybe that is a discussion for you and your supervisor. Maybe it's a discussion for you and your peers. But you are right. It's a difficult one. It's about the volume of congruence, like on your hi-fi where you turn your volume control up.
Yeah. But
sometimes, I think that turning it up isn't a bad thing. And I also think it comes down to timing and knowing your client. I don't think I would be over congruent with a client I just met. But once the relationship's established and you know each other, then, I think you can probably just turn it up. But it's an interesting discussion in a time where people, offense is a word that I would never have heard when I was growing up, and now I hear it quite often. So, yeah, it's a conversation of our time, really, I think.
Yeah, I like how you kind of brought in. What was it you said? The core conditions, the facilitative conditions.
Yeah.
So they are empathy, congruence, and unconditional positive regard. And the congruence, like you say, is intertwined. When you said it kind of made sense to me, because if you're being congruent empathically, that's very different from congruent in this is what I think and this is what I feel. If you're being congruent in a non-judgmental way, that is a very different kind of congruence to just saying something that you feel at that moment. So I like the plasticine analogy. I can see that congruence being a strong color in that mix of plasticine, but as long as it is intertwined with the empathy and the unconditional positive regard, and it is in service of that client, of course. And then the other thing that came up for me is congruence is being who you truly are. So I get that you're speaking about the hi-fi, and that may be turned up and turned down, and very, very, very much so. But part of being who you really are, when you are in practice, who I am in the room with the client is the same as I am outside of the room. Now, I'm there for them and I'm focused on them when I'm in the room, but I don't go in and become Counsellor Ken. There isn't that part of me. The Counsellor Ken, there was a Counsellor Ken. I remember Counsellor Ken. Oh, man, do I remember Counsellor Ken. He was, when he was training, Counsellor Ken was there. Counsellor Ken was there becoming I noticed with playing back recordings that the pattern of my voice changed when I was Counsellor Ken during my student times. And you have to. I mean, you have to go through that. But I'm not Counsellor Ken anymore. I'm just me. And I think that's what, I think that is the powerful side of congruence. When it then comes to feeding back and saying things like the example you used that's been posted in the Facebook group with was it the counsellor yawning or the client yawning?
I think it's the counsellor.
The counsellor was yawning and saying, "Oh man,
I'm bored now."
I'm a bit bored."
Yeah,
yeah. I don't know. I don't know where the empathy sits in that. I don't know where the unconditional positive regard sits in that. I don't know, this is maybe just me. And again, Rory and I say this all the time, putting it in now. Here is the disclaimer. We are not the experts. We're two colleagues that get together and chat about this stuff. Yeah. You're the expert of your practice and who you are and your congruence. We're not. So make your own decisions from this. But that feels a bit, I don't know, doesn't sit with me.
It's interesting, isn't it? A chapter of a book can raise such such questions. But I wonder about the relationship, and I think this is another important aspect that perhaps we need to just briefly look at, and that is that knowing your client and your client knowing you. I've had different relationships with clients through the years. Some, I've known them very well, and you could go a little bit further with clients like that. With clients that you don't know too well, or you experience as maybe fragile in a fragile process, you would be more mindful. you'd be more thoughtful. And I think, with all therapy, and the research talks about this again and again and again, it's the quality and the sustenance of the therapeutic relationship. The question you need to ask yourself before you use any skills is, who is this client?
Yeah.
Who are they? And, what is our relationship, and where is the boundary of that relationship? And I think it lives in one of those necessary and sufficient conditions, well, two, psychological contact, and knowing that the client, is accepting your unconditional positive regard and empathy. So I think that plasticine ball is bigger than we think. But yes, on the page it did sound pretty harsh, and perhaps lacked a bit of context. But it is an interesting discussion. One perhaps we should all take up with our peers and colleagues, and clarify for ourselves, I think, Ken.
Yeah, I like it. I'm now thinking of the follow-up topics of, can you be too empathic?
Yes. Yeah.
There's a lot. This is an interesting topic. Taking those conditions that are considered necessary if you're looking at the person-centered model, and asking if you're speaking about the volume control. Is there a too loud on it? I don't know. It's really interesting. Well, there it is. That's it. That's what we're here to do, is to have to discuss the topics that you're discussing.
Yes.
If you're interested, we're interested. So continue to post your topics on the Facebook page, because we do read them and they do make it into the podcast. And that is Practice Today. We move out of Practice Today. We come into Practice Matters. That's the CPD part of the Counselling Tutor Podcast. So this is what you can log on your CPD recording to say that you've done CPD. And today, introducing difference, diversity and inclusion using anti-oppressive practice foundations. Rory, a regular lecturer on the Counselling Tutor podcast.
It's always a joy to meet up with Mamood Ahmad, and his passion. His why is really, really clear to build anti-oppressive practice foundations, and to start that conversation about difference and diversity. And boy, oh boy, does he do that in the lectures that he produces for us. And I caught up with him today to talk about introducing difference, diversity and inclusion using anti-oppressive practice foundations. Easy for me to say. And this is what he had to say.
Practice matters.
There's a lot of discussion about anti-oppressive practice, diversion and inclusion within the counselling community. So this is why I'm delighted to interview again Mamood Ahmad, who has done a fantastic lecture for us for the Counselling CPD Library and the Counsellor CSR Library, entitled Introducing Difference, Diversity and Inclusion Using Anti-Oppressive Practice Foundations. Mamood Ahmad, so welcome again. How are you doing?
Yeah, brilliant. Thanks for that introduction, and also sorry about the mouthful of the title. It's great to be back.
Yes, I mean it is quite a big headline, isn't it? And let's just have a look. The introducing difference part. Why is that significant in this lecture?
Well, before I talk about introducing difference, I'll come to it. Is first of all, it's all about the wider social context of clients and how it affects them and how it relates to problems. Okay. So that piece is, I believe, missing from our practice. It's not something it's something that we have talked about. There's lots of literature, there's lots of stuff out there that talks about how does clients' lives affected by society overall, in that sense. So obviously, when we come to talk about difference, as you say, that is a major dynamic within society, within people's lives, that can so often be overlooked, unconscious, and therefore, I think as a profession, we need a bit more focus on it, and thus the long title a little bit. So it's about differences, similarities as well, and how that can play out in people's lives and the dynamics of of any aspect of a life, whether it's differences because of citizenship, refugees, asylum seekers, right the way down to the most privileged and highly status social positioned people in society. This is for everyone, including the political sphere. Hold on to our seats type of thing, including the political sphere. I think this, given where we are now in terms of what's going on in the political sphere, I think part and parcel of this anti-oppressive practice is allowing space, allowing people to be able to talk about social problems as well and what they feel about that. That's part of awareness. We are in the awareness business, aren't we? So when we say awareness, we're bringing it into the wider context, world, society, culture. Yeah.
Well, I think that's a very comprehensive introduction and overview, Mamood. And I'm always a great believer in we meet clients where they are. And when I say that, it's about their lived experience, how they're living their lives, what experiences have formed them and developed them through the arc of their lifetimes. And I think sometimes, maybe naively, people think that they treat everybody the same. That we everybody's human. We treat everybody the same. And I think that's probably, quite a nice, kind position to have, if you like. I don't think it's a very thoughtful one, is it?
It's certainly a good skill. It's a good position to have, to want to be able to recognise the unique humanness in everyone. There are problems when we come to talking about positionality, identity, and who people are in society. First of all, it can leave parts of people out, differences of culture, religion, etc., what's going on in their life that might affect them. And secondly, by becoming invisible to that, and this is where the anti-oppressive practice comes in, by invisibilizing our identities, our positionality, invisibilizing the client's positionality, we could be enacting negative experiences, even all the way to harm. We might miss out the fact that there's a power dynamic. And I think in counselling and psychotherapy overall, I think we all accept that the power dynamic is there and that we need to be conscious of it. So therefore, what I call is, what I'm using the term of a pre-fracture within society between groups of people and individuals that may be reenacted in the therapeutic process. If there are hostilities or underlying pressures between, for example, asylum seekers and the majority group in the fact that they don't feel welcome, that could be reenacted in the therapeutic process. And you can get where I'm coming from in terms of other identities, gender, sexuality, gender expression, race, class.
Yes.
That's something we talked about this now. So we need to be really mindful of what that really means deep down. If we're meaning it as a general thing, like we're just saying people, we're all part of the human race, but that's a given. But if we're meaning that we want to invisibilize all the things I've talked about, that I believe is you're entering into exclusive practice and you're not including all the people, and you could, it could be, we need to remember what human is, what being human is. There are many ways to be human. So I would say that rather than saying we're all human, I would say there's many ways to be human is my response to that. Yeah.
Yes, it's interesting. I like in your response that we talked about there's many ways to be human. I think it was the philosopher Terence who said, I am a human, nothing human is alien to me. And I think that's a really good philosophical position, because our profession is, it doesn't matter which modality you practice, phenomenology is at the heart of our profession, and phenomenology is the philosophy of lived experience. And, you know, it underpins virtually every counselling modality, doesn't it? And part of that is to understand where the other's coming from, their other person's frame of reference. And it seems to me that anti-oppressive practice foundations add to that understanding of someone's unique frame of reference.
Yeah, it's systemic. You may have heard that phrase before. It's about a system we inhabit. Anti-oppressive practice looks at the system that a client exists in and maybe allow space for it. We were trying to provide some tools for that. So we're talking about practice now. And therefore that needs to be brought in. And the anti-oppressive means that we're active. That's what it means. So if we are, let's say, as a general sense, just being human, rather than saying there's many ways to be human, then we are not active in resolving that within ourselves, within our minds, within our practice, within our therapy spaces, within the world. And therefore that can leave a lot of it out, isn't it? Yep. So anti-oppressive means being active, and also active in terms of the power dynamics individually, relationships, the power dynamics in relationships with clients and their lives, you know, couples. There's power dynamics everywhere. We accept power dynamics between groups, in society, in the workplace, and all these different systems that we inhabit. So many systems, we come to think about it. We inhabit the system of the mental health profession, therapeutic profession. That's a system in itself. So we can become aware of the multiple layers of that. So anti-oppressive practice gives us a focus to consider that as practitioners.
Yes, and I think there's plenty of reflection in what you've just said. And I guess the challenge for practitioners is being reflexive, isn't it? You know, knowing about something and actually engaging with it and embodying it in your practice are two different things.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, certainly your lived experience will help. Even if you're, let's say, from the most highly positioned person in society, there is something there. But we need to be mindful of how do we learn these skills? How do we learn this awareness? How do we learn this knowledge deep down so it's embodied and automatic, unconscious? Don't think about it. So the way to do that is a very deep question in itself, and it's a collective question. It's a society question as well, because we're talking about education. So, you know, there are many ways to do that, but the immersive practice is the biggest and most important part of it. You're in your life. Can you talk about these things comfortably, with less anxiety, fears, reactions? But it is a motive subject, especially if you are on the other end of the scale of positionality and identities. So we need to be mindful of listening to those voices, because that's where the knowledge is. You know, knowledge, I believe, is something about collective knowledge rather than just thinking of this is the only knowledge we got. It's almost like if there is such a thing as truth, we need to have all these different spectrums of understanding to come to the truth, don't we?
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think that's interesting, isn't it? You know, there's you know, I think certainly I was taught at school, there is only one truth. But I think that's a bit of a misnomer, to be honest, because I think that the truth is in the eye of the beholder. There are some things that are indisputable, I have to say, but generally speaking, in human relationships, truth is about perception and lived experience. What can be true for one person is not going to be necessarily true for another.
Yeah. I personally agree. I know there's different worldviews out there, which is fine. We're not asking people not to have a different worldview about the truth or anything like that. But fundamentally, here we're talking about clients' lives and also justice, I would say.
Yes.
Because in a way, if you think about clients I suspect there's no client, you probably think about it deeply, there's no client actually not looking for justice in some way.
Yes.
Something is unfair, something they wished for, etc., whether it's in childhood. So justice is a big part of it, because now, well, not now, it's a never urgent need, because people may want to take action either directly on behalf of themselves, but a collective action based on their worldview and their beliefs about how we should run society. So therefore, the political, the personal is political, that sort of thing. So it becomes another avenue that we haven't really tapped into. I would say from a practical sense, it's not that we haven't talked about it, but these are sort of edge areas I think we need to consider, because it all comes into that social context, doesn't it? So leaving something out. We don't want to make it leave something out. But I want to make sure we understand here what I'm talking about isn't about over-identification, isn't about forcing an opinion. It's about allowing space to consider that. And what I've found is it can be very short and very simple responses and interventions can that can give that space. It doesn't have to be elaborate.
No, and I think you're right. Sometimes just even the smallest of connections can make such a big difference. And thinking about my own training, when I trained nearly 2 decades ago on my first initial trainings. One of the things that struck me was having to release a form of defensiveness in my own worldview to be able to take on others' ideas. The idea that my view of the world actually isn't the only one.
Yes. I understand. And I think that's a... what do I say about that? It can happen. I've had experiences myself doing that as well. And I think we all need to try and understand and not center ourselves always in the knowledge and the understanding. Someone may know more than we know.
Yes.
And all that stuff. So this is a repeated aspect of it. And I say in our training is that as long as we're open, we're willing to fix things, we need to learn and have heart really and humility, then we can do it. But I think if it's a case that we've got a fixed position on, for example, positionality, we're talking about positionality, that I'm not, something we also use the word term privilege now as well.
Yes.
That can bring up backs in terms of people believing that we're demeaning them, or that we don't acknowledge that they too suffer.
Yeah.
And have pain. So.
Yeah, absolutely. And in my particular modality, which is person-centered, the kind of founder of it, Carl Rogers, talked about open to experience. As people develop and self-actualize, we're open to experience, and that open to experience, I think, for me, is about thinking about what other people's experiences are, engaging in that phenomenological kind of inquiry, and trying to find what other people's frames of reference are. And that just isn't on the emotional level. That's in the cultural level, the sexuality level, the class level, and all the other layers that kind of make up the cake of diversity.
Yeah, absolutely. And in the lecture, I presented an example framework for those layers. I won't go into all of them now. For example, there's an institutional layer, which is exactly how do ideas about people and groups get enacted within institutions, and these are multiple layers. And obviously, the other layer is our internalized oppression. That those layers exist, but they are received somewhere in our individual self in terms of what we feel about ourselves and our position, whether it's a sense of okayness or a sense of inferiority or internalized discrimination, effectively. Yeah. So the systems aspect thinking is critical here. Thinking about ideas, language, that can be reenacted in society. And bias is an example of that. Bias as an example. For example, I would say that in our therapeutic profession, we do talk about everyone's got bias.
Yes.
And that we should work on that bias. Yeah. But I would also enact the systemic on that. Why is it that's individualized? Why are we simply saying it's about the individual and their biases? Well, that's the way it's phrased, okay? But where do those biases come from? It comes from the systems that we inhabit. A lot of it comes from the systems we inhabit, and therefore systemic thinking helps us.
Absolutely. Mamood, it's been a joy talking to you. I wish we could extend our little interview longer. Maybe we will do it sometime. Introducing difference, diversity and inclusion using anti-oppressive foundations. The lecture by Mamood Ahmad is in the CSR and the Counselling CPD library. And it just remains for me to say, Mamood, thank you so much for joining us.
Big thank you to Mamood Ahmad. Thank you to you, Rory, for once again reaching out, holding those important conversations and bringing us those nuggets for our practice. This is the Counselling Tutor Podcast, episode 266.
Yes, the theme in practice, we talked about moving up to the next level. What do you need to know? A little conversation about people moving up into their studies and having a think about what the reality of that is. In practice today, we talked about, can you be too congruent? And Ken and myself had a good old chat about that. And perhaps you should too, being congruent and in practice matters. I got up with Mamood Ahmad, and he talks about his lecture on introducing difference, diversity and inclusion using anti-oppressive practices. And as always, stay grounded and stay safe.
Take the stress out of your counselling studies and get the support of Rory and I by joining us in the Counselling Study Resource. Counselling Study Resource, or CSR for short, is the world's most comprehensive assignment guidance and study support resource for students just like you of counselling and psychotherapy. See how Counselling Study Resource can help you. Visit counsellingtutor.com. That's counsellingtutor.com.
Thank you for listening to the Counselling Tutor Podcast. Find the show notes for this episode on our website at www.counsellingtutor.com.